degenerative conditions, so we're going to rock through it. How many of you are familiar with locked-in syndrome? Is it a term? These terms? Basically, what happens with locked-in syndrome is that higher level cortical functions remain intact, but the motor functions of the individual are rendered pretty much totally incapacitated. And so you have this person, this personality, this thinking, aware individual who is inside a body that isn't moving. What about brainstem dysfunction? Have you, you know what the brainstem does, right? What does the brainstem do? What's it in charge of? All of our life-sustaining functions, basically. So you can imagine if a person has some sort of brainstem injury, what they might look like. So we're going to talk about that. Brainstem strokes can be hemorrhagic or ischemic, and it's about a 50-50 distribution. One is not more common than the other. But the survival rate and prognosis is generally quite poor. Depending on whose research that you look at, whether it's US data, whether it's worldwide data, you're going to see ranges from anywhere from only a 10% to as high as a 50% survival rate. I would say it's probably, in my experience, and I think you know me, I tend to be kind of a middle of the road kind of a guy. It's probably closer to around 25%. So the survival rate is low. And it's because what the brainstem controls: breathing, heart rate, swallowing, blood pressure, our sweat, our sleep and weight patterns, all of those truly life-sustaining functions. So if they get jacked from some sort of an injury, whether it be a stroke or it could be a blow to the head or to the neck area, the prognosis is not real good. But if the person survives, they're going to have some pretty serious medical issues. Most of them are going to require assistance for breathing. They may require assistance through the use of pacemakers or other mechanical means to sustain heart rate, to regulate their body temperature. Pretty serious condition. Locked-in syndrome, as I said, the person has complete disruption of the motor pathways, but they're conscious. Typically, their cognitive functions are intact. They're aware of their surroundings, but they're rendered completely unable to communicate vocally while they're paralyzed. So they're voiceless during that period of time. So both of these conditions can result in the need for AAC. However, the situation is complicated by their condition. A really interesting story. There was a French editor, Jean-Dominique Valby, who sustained an injury, had a massive stroke, and was locked in. And yet, with the help of his speech therapist using only an eyelid blink of his left eye, which was the only reliable motor response that he had intact, and using partner-assisted scanning, he actually wrote a book about his experience. So you can imagine how time-consuming and tedious it would be to use partner-assisted scanning translation is The Driving Bell and the Butterfly. It was actually made into a movie. He was able to write about one word every 2 minutes. That's how long it took on average. It's a very, very lengthy book, but it can be done. Partner-assisted scanning is often their most reliable method of communication, unfortunately. The causes of locked-in syndrome, the number one cause is traumatic brain injury, and then circulatory diseases, then medication overdoses, whether intentional or unintentional, and then stroke. It's rare, and it's not very well studied, but the National Institute for Health says there's probably about 50,000 cases in the U.S. 90% of people with locked-in syndrome will die within the first 4 months. It has a very high mortality rate. If they survive the first 4 months, so that very small percentage, 80% of them will live beyond 5 years. Okay. And the ranges are depending on who you're looking at, where, what population, ethnicity. The ranges are of those survivors anywhere between 2 and 18 years. So, a lot of variability. Chances are they're not going to survive, but if they do, they could be around for a number of years. So they're going to need a method of communication. I would hope. Because I cannot imagine a worse fate than to have a fully functioning brain in terms of my cognition and be completely unable to respond. I can't imagine. There is both corticospinal tract involvement and corticobulbar tract involvement. If you remember back to your neuro, the corticospinal tracts control movement of the trunk and the limbs, the extremities. The corticobulbar tracts are in charge of motor movement in the head, neck, face. Okay? I'm not going to review all of that. I expect that having been through your neuro and your anatomy and physiology that you at least have a working knowledge. If you want to review, it's fine. I'm not going to review these tonight unless we have time at the end. We'll come back. But there have been some really interesting videos on the topic. Any of you familiar with the PBS series that they did on autism several years ago? Jim Blair, Robert McNeil. Anyway, one or the other, I forget which one now, but there was a program on PBS, the McNeil-Lair NewsHour, and I forget which one now. One of them has a grandson with autism, and so PBS did this series on autism, featuring him and his grandson and their family and their experience as well as others. The BBC has done a similar type of a thing on locked-in syndrome. So, anyway, so typically with locked-in syndrome, the only reliable preserved motor response is typically with the eyes. And so we're fairly limited in terms of our AAC options. We can use partner-assisted scanning, is probably the easiest, but it is, as you know, most tedious. So you have to kind of weigh the pros and cons there. You can go to an eye-gaze system for some folks, low-tech, using something like an E-Tran where you have a plexiglass and they can look, and you've got the same symbols on each side, so maybe a possibility. But that really limits the amount of communication that can take place. It would be hard to even reliably set up an E-Tran with an alphabet board because you're typically going to need fairly large, widely spaced. You might be able to get 4 across the top, 4 across the bottom, and a couple along the sides. Well, that's not going to give you an alphabet. So that's going to be fairly limiting. Some of the higher tech eye-gaze systems may be an option, and that may allow for more communication. But again, we know the limitations there depending on the type of eye-gaze system and how accurate their movements are. Some people even have very limited eye movement. It may or may not be an option for them. They may have no choice but to fall back on the partner assistance. So, unlike with some conditions, our folks that have locked-in syndrome are going to have a fairly limited repertoire of options for them, unfortunately. Yes.
One grandpa I had after he had 2 strokes, and then after the third one, he was like, he was definitely there, but he just was paralyzed and nothing, and he would do only answer yes no questions with this, like one blink in the right eye was yes, and one blink in the left eye was no. But then it got to the point where he couldn't blink anymore, so he would just, it was not a good way to go about it.
Say this to you all now. Whatever happens to me when you come to visit, accidentally fall on top of my face with a pillow, and I have a really difficult time getting up, and at the same time as you're struggling to get up, bump the plug. Because that may sound horrible, but to me, that would be like living
My
death.
grandma decided that after that. It was
To me,
after I think 5 weeks because we would all go and he would just cry the whole time because he could still do
Right,
that.
yeah,
And
I can't. To me, it would be like you're drowning,
yeah.
and you know it, and you can't do anything about it. I don't say that with any disrespect. I don't mean that. But I truly cannot imagine a more horrible state to find. Anyway. So here's some example of E-Trans, and the way that they've set them up is they've got clusters, so you're still going to have partner-assisted scanning having to take place. Because first you're going to go to which cluster, then what they would do, so say for example with this one, so the kid looks here, so we know it's that one, then he's going to have to have some way of indicating which of these is he wanting to say. And so what they'll typically do is have them look in either corner or in the middle so that they know which, if you notice there are 6 items on most of these, so that then the first gaze tells you which cluster we're going to, and then the second gaze tells you where on that cluster we're going to be. So if the kid wanted to say, let's say his name is, someone asked him his name and he wanted to say his name is Joey. First, he'd look here, so they'd know to go to that part. Then, he would look down here so that they'd know it's the item in the lower right side. So then, oh, J, okay. Then he here, so they know it's on this card. Then you look in the upper left, so they know it's O. You get the idea. It's still tedious. And so, and if you notice, most of them are set up with these 6 item clusters. That's a fairly common. So if you were to get a question on an exam about how to most efficiently set up an iGaze board for someone who is locked in, you would probably say that you would want to use how many? 8 cards with the top and the bottom ones having 6 items each. So you get the idea. Anyway, so that would be a low-tech approach. The high-tech, the Toby, like Liana uses. The iGaze Edge is another one. The Dynavox IMAX. There are others. I just give you an example of a few so that you can see that there are options out there. But you really have to be careful that their eye gaze is consistent, because it may not, it may have a fatigue factor. And so, like Anna mentioned, with her family, it was a yes, no, it was an eye blink. And an eye blink system is often more reliable or consistent. So, that's locked in. And you would often use a lot of the same types of approaches with someone who's had a brainstem stroke, because they're typically going to be connected to lots of equipment and machinery just to help keep them alive. Anyway, so let's talk about some special populations. We've got aphasia. And folks with aphasia present a real challenge, because if they are significantly impaired expressively, those same expressive deficits, particularly if they're around word retrieval, are going to impact them, whether it's verbal, whether it's written, or whether it's using some sort of an alternative communication system. They frequently will have concomitant diagnoses. A lot of times there's hemiparesis or hemiplegia. If they're virtually nonverbal, chances are they probably have some degree of apraxia going on, and they may also have some dysarthria going on. That's why they are so impaired. And when language is impaired, that's going to reduce the complexity of communication output that we can expect. And if you throw in something like global deficits, like they have comprehension problems as well, we're really going to be faced with a challenge. So we'll talk about how we can deal with that. Just some things to consider though. Strokes are the leading cause of aphasia, and they are the leading cause of long-term disability in the U.S. About 75% of strokes occur in the elderly. 40% of patients that have a stroke will experience a moderate to severe impairment that's going to require specialty care. So 10% have a complete or nearly complete recovery. 25% have only minor residual deficits. 10% are going to be so significantly impaired that they require 24-hour nursing home type care. 15% of people die from a stroke shortly after.
I'm sorry, kind of going back to the last slide. What's the difference between apraxia and aphasia?
I'm sorry?
The difference between apraxia and aphasia?
Okay, good question. What is apraxia? Do you know what apraxia is?
So there's a wiring shortage.
Apraxia is a motor speech, or it's a motor problem. If we're talking about apraxia of speech, obviously it's a motor speech problem, but you can have limb apraxia, where the problem is in the extremities. You can have a constructional apraxia, where you can't complete the motor tasks or the motor actions for completing a task. So, for example, if I were to give you I would give you your shirt and I would say, okay, I want you to put on your shirt. You would not necessarily be able to execute the motor acts to pull on one sleeve and then the other and do that would be a constructional apraxia where you can't. So with apraxia of speech, what happens is that the articulators themselves are fine, but there is a problem with executing the movements for making speech sounds. So you may know that when I show you this, that it's paper. But in trying to say the word paper, even though you know it, there's a short circuiting that occurs, and so from the motor planning area down to your mouth, that isn't what necessarily comes out. So the errors are highly inconsistent, whereas if you have dysarthria, the problem is with the muscles are either weak or incoordinated. So if I asked you to say what this was, you might say, and I ask you again to say, because you've got this weakness. It's very consistent time and time again. Apraxia, it's highly inconsistent because there is this short circuiting. And sometimes you might get really close, and other times you might be way off. So whereas aphasia is a language problem. Okay? So apraxia and dysarthria are speech issues. Aphasia is a language issue. So it could be that you have difficulty with word retrieval. It could be that you have difficulty with formulating your thoughts into words or sentences. It could be that you have a problem with comprehension. Wernicke's aphasia is very fluent, but a lot of what they say doesn't make any sense. They tend to make up words, and their ability to self-monitor is often impaired, and so we actually saw some examples of Ropa's and Wernicke's aphasia today in my 127 class. So with the expressive aphasias, they tend to almost look like they're stuttering at times, where they have these blocks and these pauses. And an example, the guy asked, the speech therapist asked this older gentleman who had Ropa's aphasia, what were his symptoms? How did he know something was wrong? And he really struggled, and finally he said, walking, no good. And he said, oh, so you had trouble walking? Yes. And they'll often get out automatics or highly emotive speech. So there's nothing more unusual than seeing a little 83-year-old woman cursing like a sailor, because those words come out. So basically, aphasia is language, apraxia and dysarthria are speech. more unfortunately, they often occur together. So it's difficult, particularly teasing out apraxia from ropus aphasia can be very, very difficult. To the point where a lot of, especially old school neurologists, will label someone a ropus apraxic because the two tend to occur so often together. Ischemic strokes are much more common than hemorrhagic strokes. They're about 85% of all strokes are ischemic. And keep in mind, what do we know about the recovery, the general recovery patterns from strokes? Go ahead. Be brave.
I don't know if this is right. I thought I may have heard this, I could be wrong. Are they slow but consistent?
Well, yes and no. Typically with an ischemic stroke, you're going to see recovery start fairly quickly, but will plateau over time. And how quickly that plateau happens is highly variable. It could plateau after a month, 3 months, 6 months, a year. But eventually the amount of progress, even though they may continue to make progress for years, the rapid, really reasonable, predictable progress tends to occur fairly quickly and then plateau with an ischemic stroke. Whereas with a hemorrhagic stroke, they frequently will not have a whole lot of recovery until a few weeks after the onset. Why would that be? Why would we see such a dichotomy? What happens in an ischemic stroke? What's the mechanism? There was a disruption of blood flow, right? And as soon as blood flow is restored, we can start seeing relief of symptoms. And depending on how long, that's going to determine how much permanent damage, how much cell death, brain loss there was. Whereas with a hemorrhagic stroke, the problem's often due to pressure and swelling and edema within the brain. Who's ever had a bruise? What happens to a bruise over time? It gets nasty looking and then it slowly starts to fade away. And that's what happens with a hemorrhagic stroke. As the blood flow is controlled, and then as it is reabsorbed, pressure decreases and swelling goes down. And because there's so much redundancy of blood flow, a lot of times what happens is that there was less tissue or brain cell loss during a hemorrhagic stroke. And it just takes until that healing process, that swelling has gone away some, for us to start seeing the recovery. And that happens slowly. A typical bruise it might take a couple of weeks to go away. Same thing. So with a hemorrhagic stroke, we see a delayed onset of recovery, but it tends to be fairly steady and less likely to have plateaus and peaks and valleys. It tends to be generally on the upswing, if they survive. Hemorrhagic strokes have a much higher mortality rate because brain is bleeding. Does that make sense? You guys ask good questions. Very happy. Another common cause of issues where we might have a need for alternative communication is with brain injury. Brain injuries are the leading cause of death in under 45 population, of accidental death. But adults 75 and older have the highest incidence rate. Falls are the #1 cause of brain injury, followed by motor vehicle accidents and stroke. striking types of injuries, like getting hit with someone or hitting up against something. Sports-related injuries are very common, particularly in the 45 and younger set. Okay? Traumatic brain injuries are much more common in males than in females, although over the last several years, those statistics, particularly because of sports-related things, are not as pronounced as they once were, but it's still very much male. Why is that?
No contact sports.
That for younger people, that is one reason, but there's actually an even better one. Yes, can you spell S-T-U-P-I-D? Hey, y'all, watch this. So what we're also seeing is a huge, huge, huge influx of brain injury in our military personnel who are returning. When we look at Walter Reed Army Medical Center before it closed, just this past year, 30% of returning vets had a traumatic brain injury. And that was before we were getting as sophisticated at detecting them as we are now. There are many who say that those reports should be probably revised and that the number is higher. But even at 30%, that's significant. You put 10 vets from the Gulf and Iraq wars in a room, and chances are at least 3 of them have some degree of brain injury. Scary. And yet, right now, average time for processing their disability claim and providing them services is upwards of a year. Their goal is to get at least 50% at 4 months or less. What do we know about recovery? Is early intervention or late intervention most appropriate? Okay. So just be aware that even if it's not AAC, if you're working at a VA or in any kind of if you're working in a military town, chances are you're going to see a lot of brain injury. So what are the special considerations if we have aphasia? Well, know that motor skills are often impaired because what causes strokes? Brain injury, or what causes aphasia? Brain injury or stroke. So they may have motor issues, they may have visual perceptual issues going on, comprehension, word retrieval. And so what we're faced with is that we have this fairly significant gap between their pre-stroke and their post-stroke, or their pre-injury and post-injury communication capabilities. And so what we want to try and do is close that gap. And for some of them, it may involve the use of AAC. It could be a replacement for their speech and language. It could be a supplement, or often now there's some really good software out there that we can actually use it for a remediation tool. There's a company called Lingraphica, and their target audience is folks with aphasia, and they used to utilize platforms of some of the more traditional types of AAC devices, but now they're moving to completely tablet-based because it is primarily going to be used for therapy, not as a communication tool necessarily. But we'll talk about that. So you have to take those things into consideration because they're having problems with word retrieval, having a device with direct selection or scanning isn't necessarily going to help them, because if they can't make that association between the symbol and what they're wanting to say, we're still screwed. So that's why traditionally it's been a fairly limited application for AAC with folks who have aphasia. Some other things that we need to keep in mind, though, typically because most folks with aphasia are going to be older, we're dealing with elderly communicators. They tend to be late adopters for technology. They tend to be skeptical about new technology. So they're less likely to want to use or engage with some sort of a device. They may be better with something more low-tech, like a communication book, some sort of picture exchange, something along those lines, because technology, as a general rule, and we can all cite lots of exceptions, folks who are older, who are, first adopters, early adopters of technology, but as a group, and I think particularly as the baby boomers become elderly, we're going to see that less often. But for the elderly, truly elderly generation now, they tend to be late adopters. They have slower response times. So if you were doing any kind of a scanning device, you need to keep that in mind, that you may have to lengthen the window of time that they have for a response. They don't engage in a lot of small talk, but they do love to tell stories. And boy, my mom, she'll tell you the story 3 times inside of 3 visits with her. Yeah, Mom, we already talked about that. It's not dementia. She needs to get out more. She truly does. Since she was so ill this past summer, and now, and it's a good thing that she's announced to us the other day that she's retiring and closing her shop, which is a good thing for her health, but it's not going to be a good thing for her mental health, because she relied on getting out there and being with her people on a regular basis. So I think she and my dad are, and I just know it's going to be watching my grandparents all over again. Anyway, so we may want to look at very situation-specific types of AAC for them. Maybe something related to their ADLs, particularly if they have a caregiver, something related to medical, and then maybe a way to deal with phone or other telecommunication. Those are just examples. There are others. But typically, what we find, like I said, is low-tech, situation-specific may be the way to go. Okay? And so I have included some information. I don't kick back from Graphica or anything. They're one of the few out there that are specifically making speech generating devices for folks with aphasia. They have the All Talk and the Touch Talk are the two. And they are really designed to be used in a therapeutic setting and can be used as a supplement for regular communication. So there's information there if you are interested. Picture boards, communication wallets, so it's like a mini PEX, tablets, and traditional speech generating devices are probably what's going to be used, and I would say that probably that's the rank ordering and how I would be most likely to go with some sort of picture board or communication wallet. Now with tablets and smartphones, if you can get them to use it, that would be my next choice, and my last choice would be a traditional speech generating device. So let's talk about degenerative conditions. What are the special considerations that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about the communication needs of folks with degenerative conditions?
And it's going to be changing, so communication is sort of communicating is changing with them.
They're going to be changing over time and not for the better. And what's difficult, one of the things that's difficult is that we should, in many cases, start training early so that when the time comes for them to start relying, that they're comfortable and able to do so. Drawback. Those patients don't want to think about that. They don't want to think about a future where they're not going to be able to talk. Most insurance companies don't want to pay for therapy or equipment until it's needed. And guess what? By virtue of having a degenerative condition, because typically you're not going to get it reimbursed until they need it, by the time that you jump through the bureaucratic hoops that you have to jump through with many insurance plans because they often require prior authorization, person's already got a headstone and it's very frustrating to try and get insurance companies to understand that they need to start training early so that they have the device and they're proficient and comfortable with it when the time comes that it truly becomes their primary means of communication. And I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Oh, I was just going to say, I had a teacher in high school, right when I was starting my freshman year, he left actually. He was diagnosed with ALS, and he had an AAC device. And by the time he got it and was trained on it, and was proficient in it, he was only able to use it for maybe 3 or 4 months maximum before he passed away. And it, I know his biggest complaint with it was that they couldn't simplify it. Once, like, it was somewhat simplified, but it wasn't simplified enough. So, like, once he was
Right,
in the later
he
stages,
got to a
it
point
wasn't-
where his physical capabilities, even though cognitively he was probably fine, his physical capabilities become so impaired. And so oftentimes, particularly with a condition like ALS, we'll want to try and choose something that is some sort of an eye gaze system. Well, when we first are diagnosed, and if you don't have one of the forms that's rapidly progressive, because there are some people that live only a matter of weeks or a few months from diagnosis, they're not necessarily going to, and there are different forms. Some of them it affects the trunk more, some it affects the limbs more, some it affects the bulbar tract more. So there's lots of things to consider. But imagine if you are newly diagnosed with ALS and yet you're still fairly mobile, and we say, oh, we need to get you a device because you're going to, and if we have the luck that either they can afford it or their insurance approves it, they're not going to necessarily want a device that relies on eye gaze when they still have fairly intact physical capabilities. And I've seen some folks being really resistant because, like I said, it's kind of putting them in tune with their own mortality, their own future, and a lot of times they don't want to be reminded of the fact that they're going to get to a point where the only reliable movement that they have is their eyes. Even when you have to break that news to them, I guess what frequently are, because a lot of times the doctors don't. It's just like with folks who have had neck cancer and they're going to have a laryngectomy. It's not the ENT that explains to them, oh, by the way, you're not going to be able to talk. You may have some problems swallowing. And they rely on the speech pathologist to do the pre-op counseling with the patients, believe it or not. So you get to break all that happy explain to them the changes in them. And a lot of times you are the one that gets to explain, oh, by the way, you're not going to be able to swallow, you're not going to be able to handle your own secretions, you're going to need suction, and your eyes are probably going to be the only thing that are consistently working at the end. So, I mean, yeah, who wants to have that conversation? Anyway, so we're going to talk about some of these degenerative conditions. But the thing that you need to plan for is get it as early as you can and plan for what is going to be needed when they're progressing through. Because where they start is not where they're going to be at the end.
I did not like AOC related question, but with like ALS and MS, if someone is diagnosed and they're pregnant, can I have a child?
I mean, it can if they suffer from any kind of mortal complication from it, but in and of itself, no. They're both thought to have a biologic genetic component. So, I mean, the kid's going to be at risk for developing it themselves later on, but no, in and of itself, it's not different than it's not like if mom has chlamydia and she births the child naturally, the kid could be born, or herpes, or something like that. It's not for HIV. It's not something that's going to be like passed on necessarily. Good question. But yeah, but just know that a lot of these conditions do have some sort of a genetic biologic predisposition, and so I know one of my wife's best friends was diagnosed with MS about 10 years ago, and she broke her engagement, called off her wedding, and everything because she said, first of all, I don't want you to be burdened with this, and I don't want to take the chance of bringing a child into the world who I'm not necessarily going to be able to take care of at some point, and that may also happen.
Well, God, they said her mom was diagnosed when she was pregnant with Ruby, and then she passed away a year later. But like I always wondered, and I obviously wouldn't ask that, but Ruby is like brilliant, like so she's totally fine. But I always wondered if it was other than this like genetic component.
That's pretty much it, but it's scary. And what's really unfortunate is my wife's friend has been subsequently diagnosed with the very slow, and it's a relapsing and remitting. She's basically in remission, has been for the last number of years, and but I'm not going to sit judgment because it's not me. But it's unfortunate because a lot of times you don't know until things play out. So, ALS, just so that you know, it's a progressive degenerative problem. It affects the motor neurons in the brain and the spinal cord. At the time of death, 75 to 95% of the folks will be unable to speak. A mixed flaccid and spastic dysarthria is the most common speech symptom. Cognition is normal. These folks do tend to have a pretty high rate of acceptance of AAC simply because they don't want to be locked in. They want to have an ability to communicate. There are typically the stages of deterioration of speech or of communication in ALS. It's a 5-stage process. The first stage is when they're initially diagnosed, and there's usually not any detectable speech disorder. And when it gets to the point where there's obviously something going on, but they're still understandable, they're in the second phase. In the middle phase, the third phase, is where intelligibility is starting to really become compromised. We're definitely noticing a reduction. The fourth phase is when they're so impaired that they will need AAC to supplement their natural speech in order to make themselves understood. And then the final phase is where they have no functional speech and they're completely relying on AAC for their communication.
When you say high acceptance rate for AAC, is that as far as insurance companies are concerned,
And
or
as
the
far as the
individual?
individuals. So once they work through that initial shock and grief of, oh my gosh, and they've had the conversation, someone has had the conversation with them that you're going to get to the point where you're not going to be able to talk. So let's start working towards what you're going to need because it's also fairly unpredictable in terms of the course that it can take. Some people live a number of years. Some people live only a few months after diagnosis. So preparing sooner rather than later is the way to go. But yeah,
Is there also like a possibility of like problems with language with ALS?
it's typically speech, not language that's affected because it's affecting motor neurons. So it's not typically going to affect. Now that's not to say that they can't have some other conditions going on where they have it, but the ALS itself is not going to cause cognitive decline.
Because I remember her dad, I was thinking that his son was ALS, but she would say like he would like look at a pen and couldn't say what it was. Like
He may have, I bet he has pseudobulbar palsy, which, or primary progressive aphasia, which presents a lot like it, but does have the language components going on as well. And it could be ALS and something else, but know that ALS itself only affects the motor neurons. So it's got to be something else that's accounting for the cognitive component. MS is a degenerative disease of the white matter in the central nervous system. So in particular, the modeling covering of the neurons is what it, but it can be both motor and sensory, is affected. There is evidence that it is at least partly an autoimmune condition. It is a young person's disease primarily. Typically, the average age at onset or diagnosis is 27, although you could certainly have people develop it or be diagnosed with it much later. There are 5 types. The most common is relapsing and remitting, where they'll have an onset of symptoms, they'll have some degree of improvement, and then they'll go into remission, and then at some time in the future, they'll have another exacerbation where they'll have a relapse, some loss of function, they may get some recovery, but typically what you see is each time the amount of recovery tends to be less and less over time. But the amount of time between episodes is highly varied. Sometimes it's very quick, times more often than not. The chronic progressive is most common in older adults, and so what happens is that they have, once they have the onset of symptoms, they will have a gradual but steady decline. You can have a combined type where it's relapsing and remitting and possibly progressive as well, where they'll have an onset and a decline, and then they'll go into remission. They won't necessarily have a recovery. So it's a kind of a stair-stepping decline as opposed to a steady decline. The is where they will have an onset of symptoms once, and we can see the evidence, the scarring of the myelin, for example, and yet they remain, essentially asymptomatic for the duration. And then there's malignant, and this is with the youngest, typically in the youngest folks that are identified with it, and they have rapid and steady deterioration. So the mortality rate is very high, and death occurs fairly quickly. Okay. They use the same model of speech deterioration for MS as is used for ALS. And unlike ALS, where we typically see virtually 95% of people with it are going to need AAC because of the impact on their speech, only about 40% of folks with MS will develop speech symptoms. So it's not as likely that A, they're going to have speech problems, and B, that they will be so severe that they require AAC. But if they do, particularly if they have one of the progressive types, we're going to use that same 5-step categorization for their speech deterioration as we use with ALS. Guillain-Barré syndrome is a really interesting condition. It is one of those conditions where there is progressive deterioration in their condition, but then there's typically recovery. And the recovery can be full or partial. About 80% of the time, folks will get a full recovery. About 20% of the time, they're going to have some degree of residual deficits. And there is also a small percentage who are going to get recurrent episodes. I saw a video of a young man who got it for the first time. He was like he was a high school athlete. He ran track and field, very active. Got GPS, became completely incapacitated, was ventilator dependent, got better over time, and about 6 months after he had made what appeared to be a full recovery, got it again. And the same process happened like 3 times, and I don't know what has happened since, but he somehow had some sort of a bizarro recurring condition. But what happens is that it attacks the myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system, not in the central nervous system. So that's what's different. One of the things that's different about GBS versus MS. And the paralysis that they experience, it's usually corticospinal, but it can be corticobulbar as well. But it typically progresses from the lower extremities up, so that their speech and swallowing are usually amongst the very last things that are affected. And it usually takes anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks for that maximum incapacity to take place. And then, just like it started lower to up, recovery tends to be the opposite. So speech and swallowing tend to get better first, and then the lower extremities. It typically is going to require upwards of 100 days or more of hospitalization, because they will get to the point often where they're ventilator dependent. They can't even breathe on their own. And so you want to really try, initially the effort is just to get them medically stable. thing that is very frustrating is that they become unable to speak, and yet insurance companies typically don't want to cover the cost of any kind of a device because they know that the typical course is that they're going to recover. So why should we get a device, pay thousands of dollars for this device when they're going to get better and they're not going to need it? So for the most part, these are not folks that we're going to necessarily be looking at high-tech types of communication systems for them. Only about 15% of GBS patients will have a long-term motor speech problem, and there's numerous cases where someone needed AAC permanent following. So the insurance companies kind of have a point, I understand. But boy, it's frustrating when they're in the midst of that, of their illness and wanting to try and communicate. So low tech is typically your best option. Okay. Parkinson's is another progressive condition. Where they have resting tremors, rigidity, bradykinesia, which is a movement disorder, and postural instability. They have a lot of balance issues. And it's due to a problem in the basal ganglia and the brainstem. And 70% of folks with Parkinson's are going to develop hypokinetic dysarthria, or dysarthria in general, but usually like, probably 90% of the time it's going to be hypokinetic. Hypokinetic dysarthria is where there's extremely limited range of motion, so their voice is weak, their speech is imprecise, their face is very flat, they don't show a whole lot of facial expression. And, but the vast majority of them are not going to progress to the point where they need AAC, but if they are, again, we follow the ALS model in terms of what stage are they at. Most people with Parkinson's are not going to progress beyond like stage 3, maybe in stage 4 of that deterioration scale, but typically something else like aspiration will take them before they get to that point, unfortunately. So the evidence-based research is really controversial in terms of very inconsistent in terms of what it's showing about any degree of cognitive decline. Some folks with Parkinson's do seem to show signs and symptoms consistent with dementia. Others do not. And so the question is, what's really going on with them? Is it truly the result of Parkinson's? Because frankly, when you consider the problem with the basal ganglia, it's extinction, I agree with that. That's movement. That's motor. It's not cognitive. So they're really trying to research that connection because there does seem to be a fairly high, fairly consistent onset or co-onset of dementia, especially in later stages for dementia-like. So they're now looking to see is there maybe some mechanism that's causing both the cognitive decline and the disruption of the neurotransmitters that leads to Parkinson's. So far, they're looking at toxins, they're looking at everything. So just be aware, though, that the rate of, or the incidence of cognitive issues amongst folks with Parkinson's is fairly significant. And so if they do progress to the point where they're going to need AAC, you're probably going to need to keep it fairly simple because they're probably also, if they progress to that point, they're probably also going to have some cognitive deficits to accompany. And then dementia. And I think dementia has gotten enough attention that you guys kind of know what the signs and symptoms are, and they're going to have universal decline in higher level skills. Their memory, their language, behavior, their reasoning skills, their executive functions are all going to be impaired. And typically, the primary AAC option for them are memory books, communication books. And it's more focused around small talk, storytelling, things of that nature, as opposed to it really being a functional communication tool. Just because we're not going to be able to restore or replace their speech, but help them kind of maintain their connection, so it's more of a social tool. I do some consultative work for some of the Mercy senior health and housing centers, and one of the therapists that I work with is the queen of communication for those with dementia. It's really interesting to see if you try and engage them just in a regular conversation, how limited they are before you get out one of their memory books, and it's like a switch turns on and they start reminiscing and telling stories, and yet 10 minutes earlier they couldn't even answer a simple yes no question. So they can be very helpful, but know that we're not really looking to use them to replace verbal communication like we are with other folks, but more as a facilitator. So, whereas Becky has used a lot of actual books, like a scrapbook, to do it, more and more people are using tablet-based, Snapfish and some things like that. You can actually do some pretty cool things with digital media, and so those are becoming much more common. And typically what you do is you arrange things around major life events. So you might have a picture of their parents from when they were a kid, and then their graduations, weddings, births, things like that. Anything that you can. You need to really try and make the picture simple, though. Like you wouldn't want a picture of the family reunion where that would be too confusing. But if you can get like headshots or context cues, I know Becky had a guy who was a farmer, and there were several pictures of like him on the tractor or him, in front of the barn, and it really helped, put it into context for him. And he would talk about how they were tobacco farmers, and that, what the process of stripping tobacco and all that went into it, and yet without the book there, he didn't initiate any communication, and he rarely responded. So, and really, if you want to try and keep it contextual, simple, large, clear images, especially of the faces, and try and if you use any kind of captioning, you want to keep it very short and simple. Okay. Yes.
What do you think of and moving into either one more about dementia? Like, what do you think happens like when someone's like really advanced in the disease and they like move their mouth because they don't talk to them like work on it?
I understand, and I've seen that, but I guess, are you asking me what do I think the mechanism behind that is, or?
Yeah, so like what is that? Like are they trying to talk or are they
I personally, and this is just opinion, this is not evidence-based research, I really think that the desire to communicate is so strong in humans that their last breath, we're gonna try and and so to me, that's what I would suspect is going on, is that it's that last ditch effort to try and how often, and I don't mean this in a nasty catty way, but how often have you been in a situation and you wanted to make sure that you were the one that got the last word? Well, imagine life dealt you a crappy hand and suddenly you're at the end. You're going to want to, I think, you're going to want to get that last word. So that's my theory. Because I think, if you think back to your language development class, and there were different theories. The nativists who felt like there's a language acquisition device and that it's completely innate. While I don't disagree, because there are so many language universals, I think environment and experience and social interaction play a huge role as well. Otherwise, my son would be bilingual and not stuck. He's been forced to learn sight hearing both languages. So if it were truly innate, then why has he lost that ability? Experience it. But I do think that it is so deeply ingrained in our makeup that that's probably what's going on. So that I have a really cool website if you're interested in how to make memory books. You can go there. I have some cases. We're not going to have time to get to those tonight, but I would encourage you to look over them. The reason being is they're very similar to what you might find on your final exam. So walk through these case studies and see if you could answer particularly the last two questions. Knowing that there's not necessarily any one right answer, multiple. It's a clinical judgment. But I am hoping I've accomplished what I set out to at the beginning. We talked about those objectives. It seems so long ago. And yet this is a shorter semester than usual because I want you to be able to apply this information. I hope as we get ready to go into the last hurrah where you guys are going to be doing presentations of your different projects, that you don't feel like I've given you things just to do busy work. I want you to be on the receiving end and on the planning end so that you're comfortable with, it's one thing to call up Monica and say, hey, I have this person, I want you to come and show me what devices we can get for them. That's the easy part. The hard part is, what do you do for those cases where you're not going to be using a device and you need to come up with practical solutions? And that's what I'm hoping that you take out. That's why we've done some of these projects. I want you to feel comfortable and not completely overwhelmed that, what am I going to do? I want you to feel comfortable with the decision